Hello, Trinity Tigers. Welcome to the Learning Together live webinar series, part of the Lifelong Learning Initiatives presented by Trinity University Alumni Relations Department. I am Leigh Wallace, political science major, class of 2006. I serve as the finance director for the city of Georgetown, Texas, and Trinity's Office of Alumni Relations has invited me to moderate this webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. David Crockett, who is chair and professor of political science at Trinity University. His primary teaching and research interests are in the field of American politics with a special focus on the American presidency. We have two distinguished interlocutors for this webinar, Aaron Harrison, class of 2003, and Elwood Thompson, class of 1985. Dr. Crockett will first answer questions from Aaron and Elwood on the upcoming presidential election. Each speaker represents one of the major parties. Aaron Harrison is co-founder and president of the Washington Free Beacon. He worked for the McCain-Palin 2008 campaign and for the Republican National Committee, leading media monitoring efforts for both entities. Elwood Thompson is a lifelong advocate and educator who strives for fair justice and rule of law for all. He teaches high school social sciences and select graduate courses. From 2008 to 2009, Thompson served as a presidential elector for the Electoral College in Iowa's 1st Congressional District. After the panelists' questions, Professor Crockett will then engage you, the viewers, and field your questions. We hope this online class will help you explore the various perspectives that lie behind the quickly approaching November 3rd election. I would like to remind the audience that you will be able to submit your questions as you listen using the Q&A tab, and Professor Crockett and both speakers will be happy to answer them. So ladies and gentlemen, let's get started first with Dr. Crockett.
Thank you very much, Leigh, for that great introduction, and welcome to everyone to this event this evening. Happy to be here with you, and we're going to start off by me asking the interlocutors a simple question, since we are now basically 1 week and maybe 25 minutes away from polls closing here in Texas. How do each of you see this field, this contest concluding next week? We'll start with Aaron, since he represents the incumbent.
All right, well, that's a great question, Dr. Crockett. I just think it's a little presumptive that you think this is going to be over next week. I got to say,
we can hope.
I got to say, after watching the 2000 election, the 2018 midterms, it's a difficult call, especially with all of the mail-in balloting, the early voting, the day of voting, and then you've probably always got some legal challenges on keeping polls open and how long we're going to count these ballots, especially in the closed states right now. So I'm not one who thinks this is going to be over early. If it is over early, it's going to be a Biden win. And it's going to be probably a clean sweep. If you see Florida go early for Biden, if you see North Carolina go early for Biden, if you see Ohio at all go for Biden, it's going to be over quick. However, if you look at the polls today, they're darn near identical to what they were 4 years ago. And I think that, you don't want to be in a situation where it's fool me twice. I think that if there's anybody out there that is discounting the chance of a Trump victory because of where the polls are today. I mean, I can tell you, I just looked this up before we started this, and in Pennsylvania, at this point, 1 week before the election, Clinton was in the Real Clear Politics political average, up 6 points. Biden is only up 3.8 points today in Pennsylvania. In Michigan, they had Clinton up 7 points. Today, Biden's up 9.4. And then in Florida, at this point in 16, they had them tied, and today they're tied in Florida, according to Real Clear Politics. So I think that right now, it's anybody's game, and I'm not prepared to go home early on election night.
All right, Elwood, what do you think about that? You got to unmute yourself.
That was exactly what I was saying. I was saying I'm trying to get it to unmute right. See, what are you, psychic? So perspectives vary a little bit. Read a lot of the polls. like we talked about a bit last week, last election cycle at this point, Hillary was actually starting to trend downward. Hillary, actually, I can call her by first names. I know her. So she was starting to trend downwards because we had those October surprises, the emails, all that fun stuff that didn't play out, but we still hear about them all the time. But she's not in this election. So she was trending downward, whereas Biden has been steady and in some places trending upwards. And when you're looking at the campaign trail right now, you're seeing Trump campaigning in places where he really shouldn't have to worry about as much. So I'm thinking that this will probably be a Biden, not because of my biases, just looking at data. I think that this is going to be a Biden win. Again, with Texas looking to be in play, the last time Texas went Democrat, I was a freshman in high school. That was Jimmy Carter, and I was working as a 14-year-old in his campaign. So things are a little different this time. Do we still have the chance of things being drawn out because of the voting issues, the mail issues, et cetera? That's possible, but I really don't see this dragging out as much. So I think that we're going to end up having Biden winning earlier than later.
So for you, we're going to be in bed by 9 o'clock.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. In Chicago in 2008, it was well after midnight Central in Chicago before I went to sleep as campaign chair for Obama then. So yeah, no.
I can tell. Well, that's because you guys won. I was in Phoenix that night. We were checked out by about 9 o'clock.
Excellent. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about how political science approaches this. I am not an elections forecaster, and I did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night to pretend to be one, but I do read them. And at my annual conference just a few weeks ago, I attended a panel where a few of them were on there, and I've been reading some of the analyses that have come out. And political scientists like to predict things well in advance of the actual election, because we figure if you can't do a prediction until a week out, what good is the political science of this? So typically political science models like to make their predictions around Labor Day, some of them even earlier. And the general consensus from the modeling is that this is going to be a Biden victory. Alan Abramowitz from Emory came out with his final model today based on the most recent poll numbers. And he has Biden winning with Trump maybe around a 30% or 20% chance, which is still not bad. If you're rolling a dice, that might be worth taking a bet on that one. But typically political science models focus on what we call the fundamentals. Who is the incumbent? How long has the party been in power? What does the economy look like? What does presidential approval look like as a proxy for all the good, bad, and ugly that can take place, including a pandemic? When you crunch those numbers, given how bad the economy has been this year, given Trump's inability to get into positive territory when it comes to his own approval, the political science models, most of them predict a Biden victory. There's one I know of that predicts a Trump victory, and there's another one that basically says, as Aaron suggested, we're going to be up late wondering. Most of the other ones seem much more confident in that. But these can be wrong. Alan Abramowitz predicted a Trump victory in 2016, but he predicted a Trump winning the popular vote. So even though he predicted the result, he didn't predict exactly the result he was hoping to. So you never can tell. And I think Aaron's right that looking at some of these early states will tell a lot of the tale pretty quickly, whether it's in the earlier or late night. So with that, then we'll go on to the questions from my esteemed interlocutors and see what they have to say, and then we'll open it up for the audience. So you guys can hit me with your best shot in whatever order you want.
All right. Well, I'll take the first swing. Dr. Crockett, American democracy has always been messy, and depending on who you ask, it's all part of our more perfect union, if you will. Which presidential race in our history most closely parallels the 2020 campaign in your opinion or in your study?
That's an interesting question. So there's so many ways I could take that. If we have, let's say, so 1920, there was a pandemic. So it could look like that because we have one of those right now. If we're looking at something like an Electoral College tie, and if you do some of these tweaking with the models, you could come up with a 269 tie. That looks like 1800. Not really a good move for either of us. If you're looking at post-election mess, you can't get better than 1876, where there was a contest for several months over disputed electoral votes. And if there's an issue with mail-in ballots and things like that, and we go into litigation, that's what it's going to look like. In terms of after the election, I think when we go retrospectively, this has a couple of options. I can imagine a scenario where Trump wins, but 8 years of Trump taints the Republican Party for a generation, and that makes the Trump victory look like 1856, which was the last gasp of the Democrats in the Jacksonian era before the secession crisis and Abraham Lincoln. Unless Trump pulls a McKinley, which is that he redefines Republican politics and redefines American politics and is fabulously successful, in which case he looks like McKinley's second term, 1900. Now, if he loses, he basically becomes a one-term in-party president. There are only 7 examples in all of American history of one party controlling the presidency for only one term and then losing it. 3 of those were in the 1840s when you had a sequence between Tyler, Polk, and Zachary Taylor, and 3 of those were in the Gilded Age when Cleveland and Harrison traded shots. There's only one example in the entire 20th century of a president controlling the White House for 4 years and then losing it, and that's Jimmy Carter. So if Trump loses next week, he goes into that category, which does not look good for him in terms of history. So those are all the options you can play with.
I'll challenge you with one. 2012.
Which one?
2012.
2012. So the argument would be that he would do what Obama did and win a second term?
Effectively, that could be a possibility. I'm not saying it is, but I think that there are some parallels there where you've got an incumbent where the race was determined to be, ended up being further apart in the incumbent's favor than it was for the challenger. They anticipated that being a much closer race than it was. When compared to 2008, Obama only lost 2 states that he had won in 2008 in 2012. The polls actually undercounted the ultimate Obama vote in 2012. So I would throw that out there should there be a Trump victory.
So it's possible you're saying is that Trump could win even more narrowly than he did in 2016, drop a couple of states and still have a victory.
He's got wiggle room if we're going to use, if you use the 2016 baseline.
Okay, we'll see. Elwood, what about you?
Well, I'm looking at a different reality, but let me preface my question with this. We've got over 226,000 known dead from COVID-19, 70,000 new cases daily. President Trump now is saying that the nation is too focused on COVID. So saying that, the current administration has utterly failed to meet the challenge of the novel coronavirus. In fact, the White House has been a major hotspot in the pandemic, and now it's a mobile hotspot with super spreader events around the country. The president himself had the illness, staff are getting the illness, Pence's people, more of them have gotten illness. So this is probably a softball, but what impact do you think COVID-19 is going to have on the outcome of the 2020 election?
That's an interesting question too, and obviously a really important one. It's kind of interesting if I could get access to the multiverse and find the universe where there wasn't a pandemic, what are we looking at? But we do have that now, and one of the reasons why Alan Abramowitz changed his elections forecasting model was because his original model had Biden winning with 67% of the vote. That's how bad the economic variable hit Trump. And he just thought, well, that's just not possible. Clearly, COVID is affecting this. So he removed that and just accounted for COVID. And that's why he has Biden winning, but not by nearly that much. And that may be the tale. Although I think it's important to recognize that we tend to look at this through partisan lens, which I find disturbing because this is a scientific problem. This is data, it's a disease. We should just look at the science of it. But we do still look at this through our partisan lens. And so you have these very different looking campaigns where the Trump campaign has these large events and they're not wearing masks and they kind of scoff at that, whereas Biden is having these really small selective events and they're all wearing masks. And so I think we're going to find out on Tuesday night which interpretation of this is going to win. I do think that perhaps more than the pandemic itself, the response to the pandemic is what has made this more of a problem for the incumbent than it probably should have been. And I think someone who perhaps had been more nimble on his feet back in March, reacting differently, this would be a different story. I don't think it's inevitable that a pandemic means the incumbent has to lose.
Yeah, and do you feel that if he had come across, if the current administration had come across as compassionate, that maybe they would have done better? Because if you look at, it's a state level, but if you look at like Mario Cuomo, whose ratings were kind of iffy, but now he's being viewed overall, even though they're critics, he's still being viewed as, his numbers have been bolstered by the New York State response there. I'm just wondering if you translate that on a national level.
I don't know if compassion is the word I would use, but decisiveness and clarity and not repeating things like, we're out of this, we're turning a corner, which we've been doing for about 8 months now. I think some people see that as not competent, but you have a very large number, I mean, millions of people who would respond in kind and say, there may be a pandemic, but you can't afford to shut down the economy and the schools. And that's what Biden would do. So those partisan lenses really greatly affect how we perceive reality, which is another artifact of the polarization that we have in American politics today.
Okay, thank you.
All right, David, next question. This is a little bit more related to my field, but I would like to just make a statement that, in my opinion, the state of American political journalism is abysmal, and it's overly partisan, it's sensationalistic, it's trivial, and it's going out of business. Present company excluded, of course. But this isn't exactly a new phenomenon, is it? I mean, you've heard complaints, and you've seen partisan media throughout American history, haven't we?
Yeah, you go back to the 19th century, the media was overtly partisan. All the major of the political parties in their cities had their newspaper that was their newspaper, the official organ of the party. It goes back to the Washington administration, where Hamilton and Madison had their own official newspaper. So that's not unusual. Of course, when journalism made the turn towards supposed neutrality and objectivity in the 20th century, Walter Cronkite eventually becomes the most trusted man in America. But then, we're not limited to 3 or 4 news outlets now. You can sort of cherry pick what you want to consume, and people tend to cherry pick the organs that reinforce their predispositions. And so if you channel surf on election night between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, you're in completely different political universes and completely different understandings of reality. Even normal news events are like that. I was watching last night the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett's her oath of office, and one news channel aired that front to back without interruption. The other ones ignored it completely. So it's interesting to see how long can we sustain that if we just simply go overtly partisan, or will this eventually wither on the vine and other types of things, perhaps like your organ, will replace them. Shameless plug.
Much appreciated. Freebeacon.com for those watching at home.
Okay. Well, totally different question. As a former member of the Electoral College and former campaign chair, et cetera, I'm curious about your thoughts concerning the need for the entity, the Electoral College. In your opinion, what's the need for this mechanism in a democratic republic in modern times?
Yeah, so I started off 20 years ago being a hardcore defender of the Electoral College. I still tend to be a soft-core defender of the Electoral College, but not nearly as convinced as I was. I don't know that the war would come to an end if we got rid of it. I do think that it does serve some functions or purposes. It usually makes the election very clear on election night, and it tends to minimize or at least quarantine problems to specific states, and we don't have to worry about them if those states don't matter. It reinforces the federal nature of our system, and that's a good thing. I think what I would suggest is that the move to something different especially a direct popular vote, I'm not convinced we would get what people hope we get. It's a mistake to go back to previous elections and say, if we had a popular vote, the other candidate would have won. It's true that Hillary Clinton, for example, won the popular vote in 2016. But if 2016 were fought from the beginning based on rules that were a direct popular vote, the campaigns would have been completely different. And we simply don't know what would have happened had both campaigns run their efforts, understanding every single vote in the country mattered, because then you would have had Hillary Clinton campaigning in Texas and Donald Trump campaigning in California. So we just don't know. And I think some people see the direct popular vote as a solution to the problem, and it would not necessarily be the end of the republic, but we would inherit a different set of problems. And so I tend to be somewhat pessimistic that we're going to solve lots of things by getting rid of the Electoral College. And I'm not opposed to tweaking it, and I wouldn't lose sleep if we got rid of it, but I'm not sure it's the reason for our pathologies.
Well, it doesn't hurt my feelings. Trust me, I had no intention of becoming an elector. Trust me, a black man in Iowa doesn't expect to become an elector. I was asked and was like, okay, sure, why not? But
and was it a fun experience?
Let me tell you, it was. If you've studied the Iowa caucuses, you should try living them. And after making it through and the actual going through to cast your electoral vote, at that point it's ceremonial. But being the honorable and getting the freeze in the dignitary section at the inauguration, as my youngest daughter would say, she's like, "Dad, it was great. I will never do this again." So, so it's great to be part, and you get a lot of insights on that. And let's face it, there's only 538 each election.
That's right.
Elwood, which election was it?
That was 2008. I was Obama's campaign chair in Northeast Iowa. And actually Hillary's people nominated me to become the elector because they were like, well, he won't be faithless. Okay, sure. So got elected there were 9 people on the ballot. And for some reason, 51% of them said they would select me as the elector.
All right, Dr. Crockett, next question for you.
All right.
True or false, in 2020, the Democratic and Republican parties have never been weaker?
How about in between, true and false? So the Republican Party had in my view, the ignominy of going to the convention and basically saying, we don't need to write a platform. Our platform is Donald Trump. That is about the lowest you can get in terms of a political party, which is supposed to articulate basic principles that the candidate should adhere to. So I think in that sense, the Republican Party has a very interesting problem ahead of it. Whether Trump wins or loses at some point, he's not going to be there forever. They have to figure out what do they stand for, and there are all sorts of options to choose from.
Well, in terms
of Democrats, what's that?
Just that. Sorry to interrupt. But in terms of that, now, what do you say to the people that would say, well, they adopted a platform in 2016 for what was then, their candidate Donald Trump, and in 20 they just readopted it, the same one, because it's the same president.
I guess I could use that language. I just still think this looks too much like the strong man sort of pushing the party in his direction. And I like seeing parties wrestle with how to articulate their views as they evolve and as new issues arise every 4 years. So I was disappointed not to see that there. On the Democratic side, you came very close to the same kind of thing, because I see Donald Trump as sort of an independent like Ross Perot, but unlike Ross Perot, realized he could not win the presidency as an independent. So Donald Trump in 2016 seized control of the Republican Party nominating system. Well, Bernie Sanders tried to do the same thing in 2020. He was also not a Democrat. He's an independent socialist, and he knew that he couldn't get the presidency on his own. So he attempted to seize control of the Democratic Party and came really, really close. If you remember this year, Joe Biden came in 4th in Iowa and then dropped to 5th in New Hampshire. No winning candidate has ever done that in the history of the modern nominating system. And so when he's basically at death's door in South Carolina, possibly the most important consequential endorsement ever made in American politics took place when James Clyburn endorsed Biden in South Carolina. And that completely turned everything around. The party as a whole coalesced behind Biden to prevent Sanders from actually getting the nomination. So I think in that sense, the Democrats understood in 2020, perhaps because they watched what Republicans did in 2016, how to do that. And so, but they still have their own issues ahead of them. Even if Biden wins, there's a question of, what kind of party will the Democrats be? They have the Biden wing, which is nice and gentle and historical and institutional. And then you have the Sanders or Warren or AOC wing, which really wants to do some very interesting things. And they're going to have to figure out how to manage that. So had the parties been weaker, parties have been weakening for a long, long time, and they've become service organizations for their candidates. So on that line, they're about as weak as they have been in American history.
Do you think that the weak parties are contributing to the polarization in the country? So like are strong parties good for national unity?
I don't know if strong parties are good for national unity, but strong parties are good for a healthy democracy. There are all sorts of things I think strong parties do in our system, and when they become weaker, we begin to move in a direction I'm not comfortable with over the course of the next few decades. We are not immune to the kinds of things other systems have had to endure or wrestle with. And strong parties, I think, are one way out of that. So I don't want to see them become weaker than they are.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you this. Prior to the current administration, no president has ever questioned the peaceful transition of power. In the event of losing the election, what actions, if any, do you anticipate from Donald Trump? What happens if the president refuses to accept losing the election? And he's actually made a statement that I've alluded to a couple of people, him saying, I may just have to leave. I didn't
just have to leave.
Verbatim, but what do you think?
So, a lot of this is going to depend on how close things are. We saw what happens in 2000 when Florida was so close. And if you have several states that are going to make the difference that close, you're going to see litigation, and this will drag out for a while. And my assumption would be, and my hope would be, that by the end of November, early December, this will be settled as state secretaries of state certify results. And even if in a nightmare scenario, the president doesn't accept them, we have people that can remove from the White House. There's going to be an inauguration on January 20th, and the accepted winner is going to be taking that oath. So I'm not really worried about a train wreck constitutionally. Trump does have a somewhat erratic temperament, and I can see him grousing about this, but even he is going to have to accept those results. The question's going to be the messiness in the meantime. So if we are looking at threading that needle and things come down to 2 or 3 states and there's dispute about, let's say, mail-in ballots, then I think we're in for some sustained litigation, as Aaron sort of hinted at earlier.
But do you see the possibility of him literally leaving the country?
I don't think so. I mean, I know some people say that he could be in for legal action himself. I do not believe that will be criminal. I think it'll be civil actions if there are any, and I don't, maybe he'll go back to Melania's home country. I don't think so.
That's what I'll talking about.
That's right.
You're close.
Aaron, you're up.
I am up. All right, I got the next one for you. Okay. Every president since Clinton has entered office with their party in control of both houses of Congress, and all left office under a government that was divided. Do modern presidents overestimate their electoral mandates, and is a functional governing mandate even achievable right now?
Almost all modern presidents overestimate and overinterpret their mandate. The classic example of this is 2004, when George W. Bush won a very narrow victory, and the next day came out and said, I won political capital, and I intend to use it. And he used it really, really fast and blew it all on a failed attempt to redefine Social Security. So the idea that you earn political capital by winning the election by one state, that is not a mandate. There are occasions in American history when mandates exist, 1932, 1980, and I'm going to start to run out really quickly. Typically, these so-called mandates are much more mixed, and the reason is that the reason people vote for these candidates is, there are 1,000 different reasons, and so it's really hard to say that's the one thing we voted on, and therefore that's the one thing we have to have from a president. So there's a lot of good political science literature on this that would suggest that mandates are mythical, the myth of the mandate, and so I think presidents would be better off tamping down that tendency to think they can now redefine the political universe because they won an election, and perhaps look more at a more traditional model, which would be to say, okay, I've won constitutional authority to use the constitutional powers of my office however I can, but then so does all these members of Congress as well. And therefore you enter into a bargaining relationship with members of Congress to get what you can pass. And I think that would probably lead to lowered expectations on the part of both the political class and the voters, and we should have lowered expectations. We tend to have our expectations build up because presidents overpromise and they can never deliver, and that's not good for anybody.
Okay, all right, then let me flip this back to the press. In the past, we know this, presidents have had contentious relations with the news media. However, none have ever had direct conflict with reporters to this degree. I've never seen this level. So what will be required to reestablish a relationship between the Fourth Estate and the White House? Some kind of relationship.
Yeah, so certainly since Watergate, presidents have had a tempestuous relationship with the press. We're not back in the 1960s when the media would conspire to not report on things Kennedy did, or Johnson for that matter. So it's a much more mistrustful relationship and seems to be increasing. And certainly when you have the president out there basically calling the press fake news all the time on a daily basis, that doesn't help things. So I think perhaps just recapturing more traditional norms. The big question for me about anything related to Donald Trump is, does he last? Is his transgressive nature going to transform politics, or is he a one-off? If he's a one-off because he's an unusual candidate who came from a celebrity side, a reality TV business side, and we get more traditional candidates from now on, perhaps we'll revert back to a more traditional type of relationship. But if people see him as being successful, then I'm not sure what will be required to rebuild that. We'd expect the media to be antagonistic to whoever happens to be in the office, because one of their jobs is to serve an overwatch function. And presidents would probably be better off if they accepted that and dealt with it in a whimsical way. So maybe we just need to have some adult leadership redirect this and kind of redefine what that relationship should look like, and be realistic about it. That's probably pie in the sky, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, I'll take that.
Aaron?
Yes, sir. Okay, next question. In 2016, Trump won despite being significantly outspent by Clinton. In 2020, we saw Michael Bloomberg spend over $1 billion of his own money to try to win the Democratic nomination. And next week, he's going to be sitting home and at one of his couches in one of his mansions watching the election results at home. Money may be the mother's milk of a campaign, but it can't buy the American presidency now, can it?
No, it can't. Absolutely not. There are plenty of examples of people who spend more money and don't have anything to show for it. John Connally outspent Ronald Reagan in 1980 and got one delegate to show for it. Rudy Giuliani outspent people to try to win the Florida primary in 2008 and had nothing to show for it. So, and your examples are part of that too. What I tell my classes is that money is a necessary condition for political success, but it's not a sufficient condition for political success. There's got to be something else there. There has to be the right messenger, the right message, all that packaging has to be there. You need to have money to be able to run a professional campaign in the 21st century, because you're talking about really selling people ideas. And if major corporations are willing to spend billions of dollars over the course of a few weeks marketing a new product, I don't see much of a problem with campaigns spending large amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, selling ideas, political proposals, policy proposals, but the money in and of itself is not sufficient to win the office. There has to be the whole package there.
So campaign finance reform was just a complete diversion.
People don't like money. They think it's corrupting, but we can't seem to get rid of it.
Maybe it was a little cynical.
Well, I am dubious of campaign finance reform being able to give us what people think they want to get from it.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, we went through an interesting debate cycle, and I'm using the term debate loosely because the first overpowering attempt, the fly
That
won.
really wasn't a debate.
Yeah, the fly won that one handily. I'll give that fly, good job, fly. The second one you had for the second time in your and my lifetime, competing rallies on TV. Because back in '68, Humphrey and Nixon did that. They actually both were doing that, and I'd forgotten about it until I was reminded. So the third debate was actually a debate. So we have a long history of debates. Think of Lincoln Douglas, think of all these debates. But do you believe that debates have a major impact on voter opinions, as in swaying them? And why or why not?
I don't think they have much of an effect because most people vote their partisan identification. We know next week when we do the analysis that 90+% of Republicans are going to vote for Trump and 90+% of Democrats are going to vote for Biden. And nothing about the debates is going to shift those people. A very large percentage of people made up their minds before Labor Day or around Labor Day or the month after Labor Day. And there are very few, small percentages that are still not decided. I always want to know who's not decided, but there are a few people. And so for the most part, since most presidential elections aren't that close, the debates do not actually convert people and they don't necessarily impact the election result. If the election, of course, like in 2000, is really, really close, and in 2000, you're talking about a few hundred votes in Florida, any single thing could actually have made the difference, including debates, although I would argue that in 2000, the Saturday Night Live sketches about the debates were probably more influential than the debates themselves. But in those cases, if we're talking about a very close election, any single thing might matter. Most of our elections aren't so close, and so the idea that Reagan won in 1984 because he said, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" That line wasn't so much as important as the concept. So they don't really persuade voters. They may persuade a very few small percentage of swing voters, but the vast majority of voters have already made up their minds. And debates are sort of a ritual we have. I'm not convinced they tell us a whole lot about how presidents would do their job, because for the most part, one hopes presidents aren't doing their job the way they do a debate. So they're interesting, they're fun. I'm not sure how useful they are, other than it's a night where we can watch them articulate some views.
And notice you keep picking on Florida. You do know that I'm here in wonderful Jacksonville, going into trying to avoid getting COVID teaching every day, right? You know that.
I hope you guys have learned the lesson from 2000, and we're not going to be in a problem next week.
So do I, Lord help us. But just say.
Surely there aren't any punch card ballots left in Florida, right?
Well, the fact that I actually have a Texas residence, I take advantage of that one. So
okay,
I helped some friends out. No, the ballots looked very much like the bubble-in ballots that Texas had. I didn't see any potential for the hanging Chad.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
Elwood, how many states are you voting in this election?
The same number as you and the same one. And it was back.
Right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more, and then we're going to open it up for the audience.
All right. Elwood, I think you got actually the next question, and then I got the final one.
I'm sorry, wait a minute. Leigh was saying something.
I was saying let's do one more each from Aaron and Elwood, and then I'll start taking the audience questions.
Okay. Well, gee, you're going with beauty and age, then you, Aaron. Okay, so the United States of America is inarguably the most powerful nation in the history of this planet, period. Military, economic, Yet many of the underlying and unresolved problems of this country have been laid bare. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. What are some of the potential ramifications of the election's outcome on some of those underlying problems?
So I guess the question is which underlying problems you're looking at.
Gender, ethnicity, economics, pick one.
Yeah, so the parties are polarized now, which means it's easier to see differences between the parties. It's not like in the 1950s or 60s where some people could say there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. There are differences. Now, at the extreme edge, you have pretty hyperbolic opinions where if you're a Republican, you think the Democrats are communists who are going to send us down to an authoritarian dictatorship. And if you're a Democrat, you think Trump is that potential autocrat. But certainly how the election plays out will have an impact on how we fund the government, how we tackle something like climate control, what the pandemic is going to look like in terms of a public policy response in the coming months, our foreign policy posture vis-a-vis Asia or Iran in the Middle East, even with our allies in NATO or South Korea. So I think, even if Republicans punted to Trump as our platform, it's not hard to look at the two parties and see where they stand historically. Even if Trump is somewhat transgressive in many, many ways, he's governed like a traditional Republican in a lot of areas. And so whether it's Supreme Court nominations or social policy or things like that, you can see differences. Now, how consequential are those differences is going to depend on each individual's view of how bad it would be if the other side wins. But I have confidence, so far anyway, that the American experiment will survive whatever the results are this year, and that we will continue to kind of stumble our way into the future the way we have always done, doing a slipshod, but nevertheless reasonably decent job of handling that, because as I think Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones. And so I don't want to find a different system. And so I'm encouraged that we have a really high turnout this year, and I'll be very interested to see what that turnout does for us come next Tuesday. But it's good to have people interested and involved, and my hope is that the results are not going to inflame half the population to reject them and resort to violence and things like that. Hopefully that will not happen.
That's the hope.
All right, Dr. Crockett, last question. What is the current ratio of Biden to Trump campaign buttons and or stickers publicly adorning the offices of the Trinity professors?
So this is an easy question to answer, mainly because although we're not locked down at Trinity, there is a large percentage of faculty members teaching via Zoom. So they're not in their offices, and most of these suites are locked up. In my office, for example, out of 10 faculty members, including my visiting faculty members, there are only 2.5 of us who are there regularly. And I include the 1/2 because there's one faculty member who kind of swoops in for a week and then goes home for a week and then comes back for a week. And that's it. So I don't really know because it seems like no one's around. Having said that, I'm existentially certain that you're going to find, I don't even want to say 10-1 in favor of Biden, maybe 10-1/2. I'm not sure I've seen, I do have in my office, because a student gave it to me, an unwrapped MAGA hat, but it is not on public display. And I can tell you that from the listserv that Trinity University has, that the mania about voting, I shouldn't say mania, that sounds pejorative, the enthusiasm about voting on a daily basis, people tell us this is where you can go vote early if you don't want to line. Let the students have the day off and make sure your staff can have the day off on Tuesday if they have to vote in person. It's intense. I have never seen this in 20 years of teaching. And I'm sure that behind the vast majority of that is we must do everything in our power to defeat Donald Trump. And so we're going to move heaven and earth to encourage everyone to vote and give them every opportunity to do that. So the campus certainly leans heavily in one direction where that's concerned. I don't even want to think that would happen on Wednesday morning if there's a clear Trump victory. There will be great weeping and gnashing of teeth.
I will fly in for it.
Well, I won't be renting any garments that day, so I'm good.
No, no one should do that because no matter what happens, they're not that important. Politics is important, but it's not as important as people think it is.
Well, you know, being a black man, I've got to disagree with you on that one. There's some existential issues on that for me.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for those questions and your dialogue with Dr. Crockett. So now let's turn to the audience questions. For those of you in the audience, if you have not done so already, you can submit your questions using the Q&A tab on your screen. So let me check over here. So Dr. Crockett, I think this is a good one for you. This audience member says, I hear about polls each election, but wonder who's being questioned. So can you tell us a little bit about how polls work? Who gets asked to be in a poll?
So in theory, if you're doing a good poll, it should be a random sample, and whether they're doing random digit dialing or whatever methods nowadays they use, because people don't have landlines anymore, they're calling cell phones and stuff like that. There's some issues with doing polls nowadays, but still the basic theory is whatever the method, it should be random. So most of us should never have been called because you can't self-select for a poll. That would bias a sample. So whatever mechanism they're using, it should be random. And if you poll, let's say 1,000, 1,500 people in the country, if it's a good random sample, that'll give you a good idea of what's going on. And that is an acceptable sample size for a good poll. So a lot of the questions on polls are whether the wording is good or not. And there's always questions of whether you survey likely voters versus registered voters and all that kind of thing, because a lot of people are registered and don't vote. The more people who show up this year, the closer that the two will match each other. But a good random sample will contact people at random, and that should be a good slice of what America, or if you're doing a state poll, what Texas looks like. So most of us shouldn't be called. But if you are called, I would encourage you not to use your call screening to not answer the phone, because most of the time these pollsters are enlisting college students and graduate students who are just trying to do a good job to give us a good professional poll. So be nice to them. I've done it myself when I was in graduate school, and no need to be rude.
Yeah,
they're working for you.
Another phone call.
Okay, and so next question comes from an audience member who says, I'm not a Texan, but we who live long distance are hearing that it is now possibly a swing state. And so Dr. Crockett, being at Trinity and you're in Texas, is this true or is this wishful thinking?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think you can rank order these states in terms of their swinginess. And so I don't think Texas is in the top half a dozen. But the very fact that Ted Cruz and Dan Patrick won their elections in 2018 by about 2 or 3 percentage points, losing some counties that were historically Republican counties, including Williamson County. So that shows you that things are tightening up. People comment that Trump beat Hillary Clinton by only 9% in 2016. So the very fact that one poll came out that had Biden tied, one poll came out that had Biden in the lead within the margin of error. I think most polls have Trump with a slight edge, but if I'm a Democrat and I have the money that they say Biden has, I'm going to spend some money in Texas, because with the turnout we have here, maybe this is that chance for Texas to go purple. So I would not rest easy. If you're making me choose, put a metaphorical gun to my head, I think Trump's still going to win it. But I think the 2020s will be the decade where Democrats will once again win a statewide office. And it could happen this year. And, if Cornyn has a long night for his Senate race, then Trump's having a long night, vice versa. So I think it's in play, but it's not in the first cut of the swing states. But if it's a good night for Biden, if things move in his direction by 2 percentage points, Texas could fall.
Okay.
Now, hold on, I got a follow up.
Sure, Aaron.
Mr. Crockett. Why, if you're Biden, why would you spend money in Texas if you don't need Texas?
No, that's a good point. I think that's true because he has a lot of it to burn. I think there's diminishing returns in money, so why not throw some this way? If he's going to send Jill Biden here, throw a little money to see what happens. But I think you're right that what Biden really wants to do is take out Florida, North Carolina, thread the needle in Georgia. If he does that, it's game over. It's very hard to see how Trump can win if he loses Florida or even North Carolina and Georgia.
No, Texas goes blue. Texas didn't matter anyway.
Let me give you a little bit
Yes.
of it's not just about the Biden campaign in Texas. It's down ticket as well.
Yeah.
So the support, we'll see what level of support, but you ask why? Because it's about building organizational, it's about future planning. You're looking at the current election and you're also projecting for the future. So it's not just about now. So that's why Biden puts an effort there. I've known Joe for 14 years. So I can tell you, I've known him personally, worked with him personally, and my youngest daughters work with him a lot. So there's a lot of planning involved, and it's not just him, it's party. Now, will they decide to say we're going to put more there? That remains to be seen. But if you got enough money to put out there, foundationally, why would you not go for the #2 state in population? At least to build some structure.
So one of the conversations earlier, I think the question was from Aaron, was about around the weakness of the parties. This question from our audience member is in a similar vein. So in a post-Trump era occurring in a week or in 4 years, how will the Republican Party regain its core conservative values? Faith, fiscal restraint, respect and fairness for all, world leadership, trade policies, etc.
It's going to take leadership. It depends on who steps up and can claim that mantle in a post-Trump world. I've seen different models of how this might work, and some people would argue that we need to take Trumpism, not the style, but working man populist type of thing, and try to find a way to baptize that into conservatism. Others say, let's get rid of that Trumpism stuff and go back to the way things were before. Some think this is just deny, deny, deny. But if you look at people who were running against Trump in 2016, a lot of those people were fairly young then. So it's not hard to think that Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Bobby Jindal and perhaps some other people who are, Tom Cotton or Ben Sass. So there are a lot of people out there who all don't necessarily get along well with each other, who will be looking at what this party looks like either in 2024 or 2028. And they're going to be the ones who will try to both read what the Republican Party electorate is looking for, but also try to lead and guide and perhaps influence the electorate. And so it's going to be interesting to me to see which way they go. Some things almost seem like a lost cause. I don't know who is interested in fiscal responsibility anymore. Once Dick Cheney came out back in Bush administration, said Reagan proved deficits don't matter, I think the party lost its way where that's concerned, but maybe not. So, but it's going to take leadership, and it's going to take people who are willing to figure out how to talk about the issues Trump latched onto successfully in a way that might be conservative. Aaron's on the cutting edge of this, so he might have a better answer for us.
Yeah, Aaron, since you're representing that side, would you like to chime in?
I'll take a crack at it. I mean, look, I think largely Dr. Crockett's right. Look, the party platform, the party values, they are largely dictated by the candidate that can most effectively communicate the ideals and the principles and the values of the party. Look, the fact is that Trump ran the most charismatic campaign. He had the most compelling story of anybody who ran in the GOP primary in 2016. Trump was the only person that had done anything outside of politics or being a lawyer. And that is a very compelling message to voters that are looking to back somebody who is not a politician to shake up Washington. So if you want to look at that would be one reason, is go out and get a candidate that's an outsider that can articulate the values that you aspire to be represented at the head of your party.
Although if Trump loses this year, that might not be what you want to do. You want to find someone.
Well, you touched on this a little bit earlier, is that I am somebody of the school that thinks that there is only one Donald Trump. There may be many imitators, and there may be some people that try to duplicate it, but there is only one original, and you will never replicate what Donald Trump is and has become. It's impossible. You don't have. He is a charismatic leader, no matter what you think, for good or for bad. And, you know, he had a unique set of, he had a very unique platform for the party. The party went with it. That's what the party wants. That's what the party gets. So that's my answer.
I will say to you, I hope to high heaven that we never have another Trump like that again. I'll agree with you that you don't breed them like that much. Thank you, Lord.
So, gentlemen, you haven't brought up vice presidents yet in this discussion, and we have a question from one audience member. So, does Kamala Harris's liberal history / platform have any impact on the election as a VP?
I think the rule of thumb in political science is that people don't vote for vice presidents. If they did, probably Dukakis would have won in 1988 because Lloyd Bentsen slapped Dan Quayle around all over the place in that debate, but it didn't matter. It's possible Republicans lost a few votes because of Sarah Palin in 2008, but that's not why John McCain lost. So I tend to think people vote at the top of the ballot, and vice presidential candidates have a marginal impact lower down. The bigger impact, of course, is their potential in the future, because you are talking about two parties who are running candidates who are septuagenarians. And so just from an actuarial perspective, it's quite possible that the winner will end up ceding power to the vice president in the next 4 years, or if nothing else, the vice president will be the heir apparent in 4 years. You know, what does Joe Biden do if he wins? Does he declare at some point, I'm a one-term president? In which case Kamala Harris is the natural heir apparent for 2024. Or does he string the party along until the last minute like FDR did back in 1940? So that's where the vice presidents are really important. I'm not sure that they're going to have a big impact except for rallying the base in the election itself.
I would tend to agree with you, especially as far as balance is concerned. If you look at our fellow Texan Johnson with Kennedy in 1960, that was because Johnson had the congressional record, he had the years in, and he brought in, Texas isn't really Southern, but he helped bring in that element behind him and his legislative experience and his strength. When Kennedy got assassinated, Johnson martyred Kennedy and was able to push through his agenda that way. But people weren't seeing him nationally in the same way. They weren't voting, ooh, we want Johnson, but it was for the balance to help bring the ticket in, but not because they're voting for him at the top of the ticket.
But Biden didn't pick Harris because he wants California. He already has California.
Right. Exactly.
And Trump already has Indiana. They're right. Picked for different reasons. And you know, the story for Harris is interesting because Biden came out in March and said, I'm picking a woman. And then when the George Floyd stuff happened, when that happened in May, the woman had to become a minority woman. And so the field narrowed and she was able to be the pick then.
I wish I had put money down in December, because I will tell several people will tell you that I told people in December and January that Kamala Harris would be the running mate based on working with Joe and especially after I saw their exchange in the debates. I went, she's going to be it. And my girlfriend went, huh. And now she's like, okay, enough of you told me so, enough. But again, it's what you're looking for as far as the mix for the campaign. It's not really looking at them. So it's not, I don't see where, in fact, if anything, Pence isn't dragging Trump down, because Trump's ego would say, get rid of him. Trump's ego would not allow Pence to stay there if Pence overshadowed him in the slightest.
Elwood, were you a Biden guy all along this cycle?
Actually, yes. I was a Biden guy when we first started working together in 2006. It took a lot for me to go to Obama, and I'll admit that it took a lot. But Then I went to him in 2007, but I've worked closely with the Biden during the affordable health when I was the state director, labor director for the Illinois Nurses Association. So I've worked with them quite a bit. I stopped after I got down here to Florida, and now being back in the classroom, I try to lay low, but I'm not too good at that, but I'll try.
For this next question, so going back to, we brought up debates earlier and whether those matter. One audience member writes, President Trump's approval rating among Black Americans has skyrocketed since the final debate. Will this translate to votes for him?
Wow, that's a big false.
Well, I think the definition here is how you define skyrocketing. So skyrocketing would imply to me that he's gone from 5% approval to 55% approval, which is of course not true. But he does seem to have some cachet with male Latino voters, and I've heard with some male Black voters, but that might be the difference between 4% and 8%.
Yeah,
so does that translate into some votes? It's some votes, but are they going to be votes that make a difference in the key states? I suppose the male Latino voters could be really important in Florida, for example, and maybe Arizona, which is very tightly contested, and Trump probably needs Arizona if he can get it. But I don't know that the African-American skyrocketing, however you define that.
The number I just heard, I just pulled it up again, 46%, that's ludicrous. That's insane. It just doesn't bear out. There is no statistic that shows that 40%, 46% of Black males. The highest percentage of Black males that I've seen in any polling for Trump was between 20 and 26. And those were the ambitious ones. I'm just saying, nobody's demographics are showing a 46% Black male voting for Trump. Black male is
a 20% is pretty significant for a Republican candidate, though.
Yeah, I'm saying, and I'm throwing out the most conservative figures that I've seen. But 46%, somebody is smoking something that is not legal in this country. If they,
yeah, I mean, if that number is true, Trump will win the election.
Yeah.
I'm dubious on that. I mean, I've seen it, and that's the only one of its kind. I would say, you know, with the amount of polling that is out there today that's available that you can go find, and coming from various consultancies, whether they be Democratic or Republican or mainstream media, you know, it is easy to cherry pick a poll to support a narrative. You know, one of the reasons I brought up the Real Clear average at the beginning of our conversation was just because that is an average of all of the polls that meet a certain criteria. It's got some that are more favorable to Trump, some that are more favorable to Biden and Democrats writ large, but it takes them all in there to account, and you get a good average of what, you know, the general consensus is at the end of the day. So I would just caution those that try to find a single poll to prove a viewpoint, that, you know, until you see 3 or 4 of them within the same time frame and the same methodology, that, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But you know what, maybe it's right, but you know, you need, I think, a little more evidence than a single poll.
I would agree with that. And I think it's always important to note that these polls are simply samples. There is a margin of error you should always look at. And if it's within the margin of error, it is essentially a tie, and you can't say which way it's going to go. So when people talk about polls being so wrong in 2016, and I think they were in some states, but the national polls in 2016 called it. It was going to be within 2 points, and it was within 2 points, and it could have gone either way.
So Dr. Crockett, let's circle back to, you know, it could be a longer election night, election week, depending on how things go. You guys have mentioned election month. One audience member writes, what do you think is the proper role of the Supreme Court in deciding election-related questions? So can you clarify that for the audience?
You know, if there's a case in controversy that arises, the last stop would be the Supreme Court, and one would hope that they would render a decision based on the facts and their interpretation of the constitutionality of these things or the procedural issues. So there's a role there, but you want the system to be able to settle this before other elements get into the system. So it's not ideal because you get a situation like what happened in 2000 where the standard line is that the Supreme Court made George W. Bush a president. And whether that's true or not, that's not the way we want the election. We want the election to be able to settle things in its normal fashion. And you know, the normal fashion may be something crazy like a House contingency election, at least that's a constitutional procedure, but we'd rather keep the court system out of it if possible. So I think the thing there is to have clear rules. And I think what bothers me this season is there are some states that have been doing mail-in ballots for a long time, and it's a normal thing. Other states are trying it for the first time, and we're also trying to have their entities on the ground trying to alter or relax rules at the last minute. That's what it just lays it open for litigation. And we hope it doesn't come to that.
If we come to trying to figure this thing out on January 20th and we still don't have a clear winner, I mean, how brilliant will the founders look at originally putting the inauguration in March?
Yeah, that would be tricky. Hopefully that won't happen. You know, and we saw in 2000, the Supreme Court essentially made the decision it did when it did because it wanted that safe harbor for the electors to do their job, which has to happen at a certain point in December. So
15.
we've got about 5 weeks to play with if there's a train wreck on Tuesday night. And the hope is that we can resolve that train wreck before that deadline.
All right, we still have quite a few questions that have come in from audience members, so we're going to keep going here for a few minutes. Getting back to the two-party system. So one of our audience members writes that there are other candidates running for president, but they get ignored by the media. So what would it take to get a third party to play a role in the presidential election? And would that be beneficial for our system?
Hey, the Republican Party won as a third party back in 1860, as a matter of fact. So, and I'm jumping ahead of Dr. Crockett, but people don't understand, we're not a parliamentary system. We're not. So it's hard to have that same kind of parliamentary multi-parties. And I'm going to shut up. Go ahead, David. Tell them where I'm going on this.
Well, there are reasons why we have a two-party system. One of the reasons is the Electoral College tends to advantage two parties. The fact that most of our elections are winner take all, first past the post, whoever wins the plurality wins everything. That's almost an ironclad law of politics that in a system like that is going to be a two-party system. There is a role for third parties. Third parties have occasionally risen up in American politics at the national level and had an impact. And you can think of the Free Soil Party in 1848, the Populist Party, Strom Thurmond and George Wallace had some significant third party efforts. In the 20th century, those have typically been regional third parties that have been, let's say, running campaigns that are somewhat illiberal, segregationist campaigns. And I think the South is different from what it was in 1968 and 1948. So I don't think there's the capital that's there for a regionally based third party. And that just makes it really, really difficult then, because Ross Perot got the third best third party performance in American history in 1992. He won 19% of the popular vote and got 0 electoral votes for that. Third parties typically will have potentially a marginal impact in really, really close states. You can imagine a scenario where if Georgia goes to Biden, look at the difference in the vote and then count the libertarian vote. It is possible that the libertarians cost Trump the victory in that kind of a situation. In the same way that, quite frankly, Ralph Nader probably cost Gore the victory in Florida in 2000. 3% of the vote's enough when you're only talking about a few hundred votes. So they do matter in those cases. But if you're talking about a real significant systemic impact, like a real third party that gains a real percentage with an actual threat for electoral votes, it's just very, very, very difficult. And we haven't seen anyone do that in a significant way since we had sectional candidates like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond, who each got 30 and 40 plus electoral votes in those two elections. Not enough to actually change the result, but enough to make a real impact. So it's hard to see what would happen, what would allow that to happen other than the self-destruction of one of the two major parties and its replacement by something else, which is what happened in the 1850s. The Republicans were a third party. The Whigs couldn't handle the slavery issue and blew apart. Republicans replaced them. So I'm not sure there's an issue out there of that significance that could do that to the two-party system right now, but never say never.
There are a handful of comments related to your earlier remarks, Dr. Crockett, on the winner-take-all version on the Electoral College. So could you elaborate more on that debate and your sources for where you're getting your perspective from, and just kind of dive into that a little bit more? We have 3 or 4 questions.
Is it winner take all of the Electoral College, or my comment just 1 minute ago about winner take all?
On the Electoral College. Okay,
so the Electoral College, there's nothing in the Constitution that dictates how states must allocate their electoral votes. Very, very early on in the late 1700s, states tended to go in the direction of winner take all so that they can maximize their impact. And because state legislatures back then chose the electors, and if the state legislature was controlled by Jeffersonian forces, they were going to make sure that all the electors were good Jeffersonians. So we've had a winner take all system in most states for most of our history. Today, of course, Nebraska and Maine are the 2 exceptions. They do what we call a district system, where the winner of each congressional district gets the elector that's attached to that district. And then the winner of the state overall gets the 2 electoral votes that are the shadow of the 2 senators. But both Maine and Nebraska are very small states. President Obama took the city of Omaha in 2008, so he stole one of Nebraska's electoral votes. Donald Trump got one of the congressional districts in Maine in 2016, so they split. But that type of system is completely constitutional, and if California or Florida or Texas decided to go that route, that would be completely legal and constitutional and would really shake up presidential campaign strategy, because now there would be every reason for candidates to go into selective congressional districts in states that are otherwise completely blue or red. But there's nothing unconstitutional about states changing the way they allocate electoral votes, perhaps in a more proportional direction. One of the recent elections, Colorado had on their ballot going to a proportional system where you would allocate the electoral votes proportional to the popular vote, but it did not. They did not win. That was a ballot measure that failed. But people keep talking about that kind of a thing, and that's certainly a possibility. I think people want to be very careful about that, though. You could very easily have all the states in the union go to a proportional method of allocating electoral votes that looks really, really fair and equitable. But if you do that, you're going to encourage third parties to try to cut into that. And it wouldn't take a whole lot for a Ross Perot or even a Ralph Nader to win a few electoral votes. And that will prevent any candidate from winning the necessary majority. In the Electoral College, you have to have 270, a majority, to settle this. And if you don't, you go to a House contingency election, and that would be quite the scene. And I'm not sure we really want to do that. We've only had 2 examples of House contingency elections in American history, and they were both train wrecks.
Big time.
Okay. We also have a couple of comments about Republicans for Biden. Can you, in your research and what you're looking at, do you see any numbers about how many of these there are? Would they make a difference? And do you think George Bush will endorse Biden?
No, I don't think George Bush will endorse Biden, although I guess I don't really know that. Whether they're never Trumpers or the Lincoln Project or just renegades who have decided they can't do Trump anymore, they're out there. But as I said earlier, I think we're going to look on election night and do the exit polls, and we're going to find that 90+% of Republicans voted for Trump. And I will go through and look at the exit polls from the last few elections and see if there's any difference really significantly outside a margin of error of this election from previous ones when there weren't Never Trumpers or the Lincoln Project. This is really more of an elite phenomenon. There are people, of course, where Trump basically said, "You guys are horrible, and I'm changing the party," and they careers were ruined, and journalistic organs died because of this. But Aaron could probably, since you're in the Washington, D.C. area, I think you're in Washington, D.C., aren't you, Aaron? Could probably tell us more about this. But I don't think it's a significant enough percentage to have that much of an impact on the result Tuesday night. But that doesn't mean that they don't influence some people. But I think it's more of an elite phenomenon, and I'm not sure how persuasive they are to the numbers that you would need to really change the result in a state.
Yeah, I mean, look, if a state comes down to 500 votes like it did in 2000, you could make a case for any group being,
Yes.
the one thing that brought it over the finish line. No, I think you hit on it, Dr. Crockett. It is a collection of elite consultants, media members, and the quote unquote party establishment that Trump ran against from Jump Street. If you ask me, they're not really Republicans anymore. Well, they may be Republicans, but they are not conservatives, is the way I would consider it, especially in present day. And I think that, honestly, once you go over the edge and you embrace the candidate or the other side, I think there's a big difference between being somebody who is saying, okay, well, I'm going to hold my vote out and I'm not going to vote this election, or I'm going to vote as a protest candidate. I'll vote for Ronald Reagan this time, or whatever some of the various ones are, versus saying, okay, I'm now actively endorsing the lead of the other party. I think once you go to that edge, you've crossed over the Rubicon, and you're now a Democrat.
Well, but we've had a history of people, prominent people from both parties doing that type of thing. This is the first time I've seen the level of organization, though. The Lincoln Project was a little different than anything I've seen in the past on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of unemployed consultants out here right now.
Yeah, I'm just saying the Lincoln Project has a different structure, different taste than I've seen in other people that change parties, or like Joe Lieberman coming out, or like when Ben Nighthawks Campbell flipped immediately after getting elected as a Democrat from Colorado Senate, then flip into Republican. You see that to a degree as individuals, but this level of organization is a little different. Now, what impact it's going to have, like you said, we're not going to know till afterwards. We're going to have to a degree. We'll know something, but we won't know everything.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to the fact that I've worked with and worked for probably 2/3 of both Lincoln Project and the Republican voters against Trump, and they're largely Democrats.
Steele? Michael Steele?
They run the whole spectrum because...
No, Michael Steele, no. I worked with him. I remember him very well when I was in Maryland.
Yeah, he's a different guy now.
It's a big stretch calling Michael Steele a Democrat. No. He and I, no.
They run the whole spectrum, though, from people who are basically saying, I'm not going to vote for either candidate. And I've seen some of that in certain circles, especially in church circles, to people who are actively campaigning to destroy the careers of any current sitting Republican congressman because they are attached to Trump, and that does a taint that they must purge from the party.
If you trace the real money behind it, it's either small dollar Democratic donors or it's big money liberal Democratic donors like Nir Omidyar.
All right.
Did you get what you need, or do you still need one of us to send you?
I think we have time for one last question. And I was just trying to pull that up here. Dr. Crockett, I know it's not your area of expertise per se in the part of presidential elections, but we do hear a lot going on across the country, different kinds of claims of voter suppression. Can you talk at all about how historically that has factored in or how it may factor in this time?
This is a range of things that could be of concern here historically. It ranges all the way from very severe voter suppression in all southern states for about a century after the Civil War, when it comes to basically using terrorist tactics to prevent African Americans from voting, despite their 15th Amendment rights. And on the opposite side, the injunction to vote early and vote often, leading to, of course, corruption in the ballot box in terms of who can package the votes most effectively. And of course, Lyndon Johnson was famous for finding enough votes in Duval County to win his seat back in, I think, 1948. So the fact that that has happened in American history, and actually it's a long history of both types of activities, is why you see efforts on both sides to address issues. And again, we look at this through our partisan lens. And so if you're concerned about the security of the vote, you like voter IDs, if you want more people to vote as easy as possible, you don't like voter IDs. The governor in Texas has decreed that there will only be one drop box per county, which, if you think about what Harris County looks like, seems just utterly insane, because there are millions of people going to one location if you want to drop your mail-in ballot in that one place. So I think this ranges the whole spectrum, and people will adopt the strategy that seems to make sense to them from a partisan perspective. And I think there's a mix of motives there. Some people, the motives are somewhat self-serving, and other people honestly believe X, Y, or Z about what should happen there. So I think the best course of action is to take a very reasonable approach of how you can secure the ballot while also encouraging people to register and actually vote. There's a long history of doing this. It's not clear to me that either party is free of that taint, but I don't know that I can comment with great authority more on this current election cycle.
Okay.
I would probably end up insulting one of the two sides if I did that, and I don't want to do that. I want to preserve my objectivity, my neutrality.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking these questions. Gentlemen, thank you, Aaron and Elwood, for participating. Dr. Crockett, any final thoughts you want to leave with the audience before we wrap up this evening?
Yeah, I guess, as I look at this from a comparative perspective, I like to take the grand sweep of history, and there are a lot of people using a lot of rhetoric now that ranges from this is the most important election in our lifetime, which is probably not true, to the world's going to come to an end if the wrong person wins, which I think is probably not true. And I don't like to see the agitation that takes place by forces on both sides to encourage followers to delegitimize the results even before we have those results. We're going to come through this, and we're going to come through it well. And I would encourage people to take a deep breath and let the system work out. If we end up with a bit of a train wreck on Tuesday night because of how close it is, things will work themselves out and the Republic will survive. And I do not think we are that close yet to going the way of Germany in 1933. I think Elwood mentioned at least half of the name there earlier. And I'm not really worried about Donald Trump looking like the authoritarian, because I think he actually in many, many ways is a very weak president when it comes to the constitutional questions, the institutional features of our system that would control him. I'll be much more concerned if someone like Donald Trump, with his demeanor, actually won a decisive popular vote and electoral vote victory. That's the kind of character that you want to watch out for in terms of moving in the direction of a real tyranny. And I don't see anyone like that there right now. So my best advice is look at a lot of examples in history. We've had crazy elections in the past, and this may be one of those as well, but we will come out of this at the end with someone taking the oath of office on January 20th, and we will continue forward. Politics is always messy. And that's what it is in a continent-sized republic.
Okay,
Vote.
great. That's right. And go vote. Thank you so much for that. Again, thank you to our panelists as well. Thank you out there, audience members. There are way more questions here than we could ever have time to answer. So I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them all, but thank you so much for participating today and sending them in. I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. For additional Learning Together content, including other webinars, the screen changed and it threw me off. Excuse me for that. If you enjoyed this webinar, you can find more at the link on the screen, trinity.edu/alumni. There are other webinars, podcasts, and book club information there. And you can visit the Lifelong Learning page. And you can see it there on the screen. Thank you again for joining us, and go Tigers.